let's start with, have you kept in contact with anyone that you interviewed for the book?
I've kept in touch with quite a few of the people. I was actually texting with Brian Sanderson this morning.
Oh, wow.
Um, we talk periodically. He's doing quite well. He just taught, I think, yesterday or earlier this week, a class to a police force down in Virginia. Um, so it's nice to hear that he's doing well. Um, I talked recently to Kyle Mohammed, who's staying the course. I think he said he's working. He's has his apartment and he's doing all right. So it's always reassuring to check in with these people and find that they are in fact still doing all right.
Yeah, I bet. That's definitely. Do you ever feel nervous when you haven't heard from someone in a while that you heard from recently?
I'm always nervous because you never know, and the deal with mental illness is that sometimes you're well and sometimes you're not, and so I always think, uh-oh, I hope that they just missed my text or I forgot to respond to the last one or whatever it is to that, not that something has happened.
Yeah, definitely. When you were doing your research, what do you think was the most fascinating piece of the book while you were writing it?
How long do you have? I loved every minute of it. I think the historical piece was shocking to me in a way I didn't expect it to be. Not just the realization that we've been doing the same thing over and over again, but going back and looking at writings from the reformer Dorothea Dix from the 19th century, and then from people who had worked in the hospitals in like the 1930s and 1940s here, and realizing that yes, the language has changed because it's been 200 years, but that really what they're saying and what they're describing and what we've done hasn't changed at all. And whether it's talking about people being warehoused and overcrowding and understaffing or the terrible food or the lack of understanding of what the best answer is, was at once absolutely horrifying, but really eye-opening. Um, so that historical piece, I think, to me was really surprising. In the modern day stuff, I think the whole restoration to competency question was really interesting to me because it's something that we hear about, but it's not something I'd spend a whole lot of time thinking about. Oh, that person has been sent for restoration, or that person has been sent for, we're getting their competency checked. But to realize that there's this whole mechanism and all these ways to really try to, I don't know if evade is the right word, but to sort of get around this problem. What does it mean to make somebody sane enough to stand trial? And how do we get to that point? And can you be sane enough to accept a plea bargain but not stand trial, or sane enough to accept a plea bargain period? To me is a really interesting question.
Right. When you were talking about researching the history of how we have dealt with people with mental illness, um, did you do that research first, or did you go and visit the prisons and the jails first, or was it kind of in between?
It was kind of in between.
Okay.
The different pieces would come in at different points. I think I ended up doing, I mean, you can't do any research on mental illness in the criminal justice system without running across Dorothea Dix, for one, because she, this reformer from the 19th century who insisted that we get people out of the jails and into asylums in the truest sense of that word. You can't do any research without encountering her in some form. But I think it didn't hit me how significant she was until I started talking to people, and I talked to a sheriff and say, what's going on here? Why aren't you talking to the police officers? Why aren't you telling them not to bring people in? Or how are you handling this? And say, well, we can't turn anybody away. And it's exactly what she's writing 150, 200 years ago.
Wow. That must have been interesting to see that happening now, and then you were just reading about that.
It's a very bizarre sort of Groundhog Day feeling of
Oh yeah.
just repeating the same errors over and over again.
That's a great way to put it. I'm sure that's exactly how that felt. Yeah. Let's see. So I wanted to get to a couple of questions. Let's see. Make sure I got them. So Adam in our book club, I'm going to read his full comment so I can get it all. It seemed from the book that there was a cycle where we operate asylums. They turn bad, so we close them. Then people with mental illness get caught up in the criminal justice system, which doesn't work, so we open asylums, etc. Is there a way to break this cycle, or should we recast how we think about law enforcement to make mental health care part of their remit?
I mean, I think this is the $1 million question, right? How do
Right.
we fix this? How do we break this cycle? And I think we can look back to the time before we were even a country, so pre-Revolutionary War, and it's clear that we understood on the one hand that it's our responsibility as a society to do something for people with mental illness, and whether that responsibility is because we're that sense of responsibility is because we're concerned about those people or because we're concerned about our own safety. I think depends who you're talking to and when we're talking, but it's clear that we understand that we need to do something, but we can't quite figure out what. And so you can go back to the 1760s, and Benjamin Franklin is saying, well, people with mental illness should be in a hospital, but it should be a piece of a regular hospital. And then you go to Virginia 20 years after that, still before we're a country, and they're saying, well, we should have a hospital specifically for people with mental illness. And so, what's the answer? Do people need to be in the hospital? What do we do when somebody doesn't want to be in the hospital? And I think all these questions, we can't quite figure out what the answer is, which is why we end up with this cycle of we try something and then it turns into this mistake, and we, what we tried to do to fix it becomes the problem. And so, to me, the question is, I think the key point is to remember that these are people that we're talking about and people who need help in some form. And so, what is, on the one hand, what is the best way really to help people who need our help, the people who are most in need of our help? And then, how do we do that in a way that doesn't turn into the mistake again? And so, I see it even today when we say, okay, well, we have all these people with mental illness who are in our jails. So let's build a special mental health unit within the jail. And on the one hand, we say, okay, that's great. Of course, we want people to get the best health care that they can get. On the other hand, is it making it so that that's the best place for somebody to get mental health care is in jail? Or are we making it um, the only option for somebody who needs mental health care to be in jail? Or if we build a psychiatric hospital instead of a jail, is that condemning people to be in the hospital? We've tried that. What is the answer? I think it's safe to say that law enforcement is not the answer. That we need to, yes, acknowledge on the one hand that dealing with mental illness has become part of the job of law enforcement officers. And again, we can go back to the 60s. This is not new. We can go back to the 60s and see that law enforcement was being asked to take care of people with mental illness or in an emotional crisis. But I don't think it should be on their heads necessarily. It's not necessarily the right person to be handling this. So why are we making a better version of what we shouldn't have?
Right. I think going back to what you were saying is we have to remember that we're talking about people, right? We're talking about people here, not just this thing that's happening. Um, Was it difficult when you were talking to different, I think a lot of them are law enforcement officers, when they were saying things like anyone well enough to commit a crime is well enough to go to jail, or the Hug a Thug program? Was it difficult to stand there or sit there and kind of hear that, because you are thinking about these are people?
It is hard to hear it because, of course, as you say, they are people. On the other hand, if you put yourself in the position of the law enforcement officer, I think it's very easy for us to say that the cop is being mean and unfair. And when we think about what law enforcement officers are being asked to do, and whether that's a police officer or a corrections officer in a jail or a prison, it's a hard job. And it's a scary job sometimes. I went out on a lot of ride alongs where you realize you're showing up at somebody's house. You often don't have a whole lot of information about what's going on, and you don't know what's behind that door. And so it might be somebody who's having a crisis. It might be somebody who's having a crisis with a loaded gun in their hand, and you don't know. And you don't have the training necessarily, or don't have the right training. You're not a psychiatrist, you're not a psychologist. Um, to recognize what the problem is, to know how best to de escalate the problem. And even I was in a training session where we had to do role playing. And so they had people they were actually police officers, I think, who were playing people in a crisis. And then we had to be, I was with a bunch of law enforcement officers who were being trained, but they counted me in their group, and we had to go up and try to talk them down. And I remember standing there talking to a guy who was, I don't remember the exact scenario, but it was something like his girlfriend had left him and taken the kids, and he was mad and he wanted to maybe burn the house down or himself or this or that. And even though you're sitting in this auditorium full of people and you know that it's not a real scenario, you're suddenly in this kind of panic, like, oh my gosh, what's the right answer? What do I do? What if I say the wrong thing? And not even like worrying about my safety, but what if he goes and lights this house on fire where his girlfriend and the kids are? Like, that's frightening. And so to think about how do you respond appropriately and how should these people respond appropriately is frightening. And so yes, it's awful to hear them say this is somebody who doesn't deserve our sympathy or our care. But I think we also have to think of it from the other side. Like, here's somebody who's been handed this very difficult, potentially very dangerous job, without the tools to handle it.
I guess going in before you did the ride alongs and you went and kind of did this role playing, did you expect to kind of empathize with law enforcement officers as you did, or did it take those ride alongs to empathize with them?
I mean, in some ways, I don't think I expected to empathize with, or let me try that again. I think you can, depending how you think about it, it can be really hard to empathize with any of the people in this, because it's very easy to say, here's this person, yeah, they have a mental illness, they still committed a terrible crime. Why should they have my sympathy? Why do they deserve quote unquote special treatment? The flip side is, here's this police officer who just arrested this person who's obviously sick. Why do they deserve my sympathy? But I think as soon as you stand in their shoes and think about what they're up against, whether it's a system that failed them or a family that failed them, or a job that they didn't sign up for, it very quickly changes your perspective.
I think that's a great point. I think we tend to forget that there's both sides. Everybody's human that's involved. So everyone's going to have human emotions of what's involved too.
Exactly. And the other thing is that in talking to law enforcement officers, from police chiefs through corrections officers, the number of people who had some connection to mental illness, whether it was a family member or a friend or a case that particularly affected them, I think is a really good reminder that everybody has some connection to it. And it may be that you're walking past that person on your way to get coffee in the morning, or that you are related to that person, but remembering that piece, I think, really helps.
Was that part of your interview process, was to ask everyone if they had a connection to mental illness, or was that kind of volunteered to you?
It I'm trying to think if I ever asked anybody directly. I don't think I ever asked directly. For better or for worse, I think it's one of those questions that still feels, you know, let me rephrase. I'm in a job where I can ask almost any question without feeling uncomfortable about it. Um, because that's what I'm supposed to do, right? Is ask questions. On the other hand, to ask, do you have a connection to mental illness, or do you have a mental illness? Do you have experience with mental illness? Still feels a little bit overly personal um, sometimes, which I think says a lot about how we think about mental illness. Um, but what I found is that as soon as you start talking about mental illness, the stories come out. Um, and I found in the time that I was working on this, when people found out I was working on a book about mental illness, I learned about more parents and siblings and cousins and friends than I ever knew existed. So I guess I didn't have to ask the question, because it just kind of came naturally from the conversation at a certain point.
Interesting. Okay. So, is there anything that you learned in your research or what you saw that didn't make it into the book that, thinking back, you kind of wish it did, or if there was a part two?
um, I mean, I always say I could have written 20 books
Hmm.
and addressed more pieces of this. I think every time I think I've heard every possible permutation of the criminalization of mental illness and how we deal with people with mental illness and how we deal with them, particularly within the criminal justice system, I hear another story. So since the book has come out, I regularly get emails or messages on Facebook from people who are dealing with this. And the stories are just astonishing. There was somebody I heard from last summer, um, whose brother thought he was Jesus Christ and broke into a pizza place, stole, I think, some pizza and a soda or something, and then called the police on himself, was arrested, in my opinion, inappropriately. Um, and then, while sitting in jail waiting to be transferred to the hospital, ended up hurting himself very, very badly. And now is having trouble getting into the hospital he was originally going to go, because they won't take him with his injury. Um, but I mean, we could sit here for 3 days and we wouldn't run out of stories. And so I wish that I could tell all of them, because I think it's so important for people to realize that this is happening every day, every moment in our country.
How do you sit with all of these stories that, you've learned so much while writing the book and doing the research, but then, like you're saying, you got these Facebook messages and people are continuing to share stories with you. How do you hold on to them but practice self-care? This, it's a heavy book to read, and we're hearing a lot of my colleagues are like, this is taking me a while to get through. And I'm like, yeah, it's hard, but what would you say self-care is when you're doing this kind of work?
I mean, I think it's very individual what takes people out of it. To me, it's always important for me personally to remember that I'm one of the lucky ones. And so I would go to jail, and it's exhausting and traumatizing and difficult to go to a jail just to visit. And I say that knowing that I'm getting the absolute royal treatment and I'm not seeing the worst of it. And I know I get to go home when I'm done, and I don't have to eat jail food, and I don't have to pay to call my family, and all these things. Um, And so part of it for me is just remembering that I have nothing to be exhausted and distressed by, and that it's my responsibility to take that and share it. um, that said, it is exhausting and traumatizing and upsetting. um, I stopped watching TV shows about jail,
Mm.
um, because I felt a little bit like I'm living this, not in the sense of literally living it, but seeing it with my own eyes and talking to people who are experiencing it. Um, Trying to find things that I like and that are relaxing and reassuring and have nothing to do with any of this is always helpful.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. So one of the most important things to me when I was reading the book was at the very beginning when you talked about that during the book you would be saying person with mental illness and you would say person in jail instead of calling somebody an inmate or crazy person or whatever it is. It was really important to me because at the coalition, part of my role is to do a lot of public education and within my department. So we're going out and give presentations all the time, and especially when we're talking to children and kind of high school students, I'd say we really try to emphasize that people first language and saying people experiencing homelessness, not homeless people. And we've had a couple times during presentations where a kid will raise their hand and it's like has a question about homeless people, and then they'll catch themselves halfway through and they actually correct themselves, and it's really exciting. But so when seeing your words and you pointing that out from the beginning was really important to me. But why did you choose to not only do that, but to actually talk about it?
Partly because I want people to change the way they talk about people with mental illness and the way they talk about people who are in the criminal justice system or have been in the criminal justice system. I think we've moved in much of our society away from offensive language. So having to do with race, for example, um, we've largely learned that we shouldn't talk that way. I think that both within the criminal justice system and within the mental health care world or the mental health world, those have lasted a little bit longer. And so I'll hear things like talking about somebody who's been convicted of a felony as a felon or an ex-con, um, or even just the use of the word crazy, um, which has sort of entered our language as really being separated from mental illness, but it's still used. And if you think about it, it's still kind of offensive. Um, and so I wanted to call attention to it. Um, and I would like to think that we can change and think about people as people first. I mean, we're starting even to see it in the physical health world, which is great. It's not an epileptic; it's a person with epilepsy. Um, and so I think it's important for those of us who are talking to these people and are already able to see those people as people, um, to make sure we use the kinds of words that help change the way people think about it.
Perfect. I appreciate you doing that. And I know that is something that we talk about at the coalition. And we have talked about in your book that we're excited you did that. So
You're
I
so
appreciate you
glad.
pointing that out. um, one other question from our book club member, Deb. She asked if you've ever been asked or if you chose to testify on any maybe state or federal bills that relate to the criminal justice system or mental illness at all.
I haven't yet, but I'd be excited to. Um,
Oh, okay.
yeah, I mean, it's always an odd position to be in as a journalist. Is it my job to tell legislators what's happening? But I think in a certain sense, it's very much what we do, right? We hear stories and we tell people what's going on that they might not know about. One of the things I found really shocking is how, particularly in the criminal justice system, there's like a piece of our society for whom that is part of their everyday life, and then there's part of our society who has absolutely no idea that it's going on in any um, sort of regular way. And so, for if you're able to look over and see that this is happening, I think it's part of our job to say, hey, wait a second, do you realize that there are people in jail because they can't make $100 bail? Or do you realize that people are being arrested because they're breaking the law by sleeping on the sidewalk, but they're doing that because they don't have another place to sleep, not because that's where they want to sleep? And so I think that it's absolutely part of our job to do that.
Interesting. Okay. So, Ollie, for the last question to be is actually to ask for you to give us a question. We'll be going live on Facebook to talk about Insane on March 19th. And I'd love to be able to start the book club for our viewers that are watching live with a question from you. So, do you have any questions that you always wonder of your readers that we can ask?
I would love to know what they're seeing um, in Colorado, if that's where most of the readers are, but really in their own communities, um, how this is playing out and how it's playing out in different parts um, of our society. So one of the things that I saw a lot of is, the police know what's going on in the world of the police, and the lawyers know what's happening in court, and the sheriffs know what's happening in jail, but none of them understand what's happening across their different sectors. And I'm always curious, what do people who are in different parts of that, or who are completely separate, just going about their regular old daily lives, where do they see this playing out? Is it that you're seeing officers arresting somebody who's homeless for sleeping on the street? Is it that you're seeing a police car respond to that person who's talking to somebody that nobody else can see? I know that Colorado just reversed its ruling, but had said that unless you were coming in through the criminal justice system, you could not get into the state hospital because there was no space. How's that playing out? And what's the right answer when you're looking at it from there?
That's true. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for doing this with me. I was so excited as I was reading the book, and when I originally reached out, I was like, "There's no way this is going to happen," but just out of the blue, guess just give it a shot, and then it happened. So thank you so much personally, and then I know everybody in the book club's gonna be really excited to watch this.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was so fun.